Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Council Sessions from the Inside the Force. I don't know if we can call this a network at this point, I guess. This is kind of becoming a network of sorts. So, episode, this might be episode 3. I don't know. I think Dave's also recording one right now. So, this is Casey Cooley, and I'm with Cody Geiler. Hey, man.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, buddy. So, let's get into it. This is at least the third episode. That we've been putting out there. We're trying to record a bunch of these and putting them out, every 2 weeks or so. But this topic we've done so far, who is the best Jedi? We did one about when did the Jedi Council fall in the first episodes a couple weeks ago. This one we're going to talk about essentially legends versus canon. We're just calling the new canon basically. And so basically the big question we're trying to solve here is legends better than the current canon? And that's kind of a loaded question, and we'll unpack it a little bit, and we'll definitely be fair, I hope. But let's get right into it. Well, real quick before I get into it too much, Cody, what is your experience with the Legends timeline? And so basically, and for those of you who are watching don't know, up in from the moment the original movies came out up until 2014, 2014 is when the Disney officially killed the canon of the expanded universe in books and comics and games, killed it and restarted it with kind of the new era of Star Wars when they bought Lucasfilm. So up until the originals till 2014, all that material and books, everything I just said, is called Legends. So, Cody, what is your experience with that Legends era?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I grew up probably very similar to you in the 90s, watching a lot of the original trilogy on, VHS tape, and then, digging into a lot of the books and comics. There were, and mostly games. I mean, games were probably sort of the first thing that brought me
Mm-hmm.
in, besides the movies, and obviously the toys is obviously a big part of it all. But yeah, so playing a lot of the games, that probably started to come out closer to when like PlayStation and things like that came out, maybe a little past the 90s after Phantom Menace into the like mid 2000s. But then like
Right.
going back and getting, different books and comics about, whether it was the new Jedi Order
Mm-hmm.
or that sort of Jedi Academy on the game side, the Jedi Knight, Jedi
Yep.
Academy games, of course, were huge influences for me. And then they had the books that I feel like don't get as much, they don't get talked about as much as the heir to the heir to the Empire, the Thrawn trilogy.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's like that Jedi Academy trilogy,
Those.
that talks
Yes.
about Luke, Leia,
Yes.
Jason, Jaina,
Mm-hmm.
the Ben and
All the
Ray sort of
solos. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
offshoot, the OG
Yeah.
Ben and Ray, so to speak.
Yes.
But yeah.
No, and you mentioned some great stories. Yeah, we definitely have a similar upbringing. I really didn't get into Legends or the expanded universe outside of the games. I played all the video games throughout the 90s. The N64, Rogue Squadron, Pod Racer games, all in the Jedi Academy games, KOTOR later, kind of the later early 2000s. But no, the book side, I didn't get into that until middle school, really. Like actually being invested into it, I kind of dabbled a little bit before that. But the books, yeah, middle school, then kind of through high school there. But and you mentioned some great stories, and it kind of brings me to a point. Like I want to preface this discussion of like saying like we love Legends and we love the current canon. There are definitely great stories out of both eras, and there's stories in both eras that we aren't too fond of, but they're all still good. It's also Star Wars, and it's all still enriching. It's what you as a consumer essentially align yourself with. But so let's get into this a little bit and to kind of give some context. Again, like Legends started, I think if the official date of Legends starts in 1978 with the first major book, which is Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which I actually haven't read. I know about it. I've read about it, but I haven't actually read the book itself yet, even though I need to. So that kick started the Legends era in a sense, and I've heard nothing but great things about this book. So definitely Legends had a great start with that, and then pretty soon after that, it had the Han Solo trilogy of books, which I don't know if you've read too much about them. I don't know,
I haven't.
Dave on our show, he's read those and he loves those, and they were talked about a lot when the Solo movie was coming out, and there's some similarities there. So basically, I'm saying like the Legends era started very strong, and then you mentioned some in the 90s, the Thrawn Trilogy. In the early 90s, 91 to 93, there were 3 books there, fantastic books, and those are the books that started me on the EU Legends kind of path. I just flipped through it at a friend's house, like this is amazing. Like this is a movie. This is the continuation of a movie, which has got me sucked right into it. And then the bulk of the Legends world was the 90s and the early 2000s. You mentioned also the New Jedi Order, huge series. There's like 20 plus books for that. And that's where I was really, that's in about that time, like I was like halfway through the series and I kind of like just fizzled away. I was getting into school stuff and academics and all this kind of, stuff. And I fell away from it. And then in college, Disney bought Lucasfilm, reset the canon. And then I was kind of like, I had like a half a dozen or so books I haven't read yet. I'm like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to read these books now because they're not canon anymore, technically. And then they're restarting the canon. So then come a lot of new books in the new canon, which was fun. So let's kind of analyze this a little more. There is a rich history in Legends. You mentioned some characters. You mentioned the Solo twins, basically. There's 3 Solo kids. You mentioned, I don't think you mentioned, but like in the Thrawn trilogy, we're introduced to Mara Jade. We're introduced to so many crazy, amazing, important characters, and important meaning just their influence on the canon and influence on the mythology of Star Wars. Mara Jade married Luke Skywalker. That's a huge character for another huge character, Luke. They had a son. Han and Leia had 3 kids, and there's I'm not going to spoil a whole lot of it. I mean, we'll probably spoil some of it during the show, but there's so much amazing stories with that. Granted, that bulk of the timeline of the EU is set after Return of the Jedi, which there were no new movies planned. So they had dozens of years to play with, in the timeline. New Jedi Order took place like 20 to 30 years after. So you had this crazy playground. Whereas now, the new canon, they were planning these new movies. So then you're creating these little pockets of where no stories are being told, and they're kind of fitting in these new books, these new comics, these new games, fitting in these little holes. There's no Old Republic now. Now we're getting the High Republic, but it's still, it feels different. And that's going to be kind of the challenge, is putting a finger on like how it feels different, how this new canon, it doesn't quite feel like it's amounting up to the same level of importance as the old canon, as Legends. So that kind of brings us to the first question here in this discussion is this new canon that we're talking about, is it important, or is it influential on the canon of Star Wars as a whole, on mythology? Does it push the boundaries of the mythology? And I think that's going to be one question that will kind of help solve this debate, this issue that we're trying to mull over, is it important? Well, we're going to talk about some of these stories, because there are great stories in new canon. But Cody, let's go. I'll get your opinion then, and go ahead and bring up as many of these stories as you can think of, because I can definitely think of 3 or 5 amazing new canon stories that might, sway me one way or the other in this question. So overall, is new canon important and influential to Star Wars?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some of the nuances of it. I feel like, in general, I do want to preface it with, I like a lot of the stories that we have now since Disney bought Lucasfilm. There's a lot of there's some really good, specifically comics.
Yes.
Ones that just come to mind off the top of my head is, the Vader comic, and then the newest one, The Rise of Kylo Ren, which they both have common denominator, which is Charles Soule,
Yeah.
who's doing amazing things. And so there's really
Yes.
good authors. But overall, I do feel like what you were sort of teeing up is that the new canon feels like we're trying to fill time gaps, like
Hmm.
gaps of time. You
Yeah.
know, we had but obviously before episode 7, they had to wipe it all clean slate. Makes
Yeah.
total sense. I
Hmm.
don't think they should go back and change that. That's not what I'm saying. But just as you compare and contrast the different stories that they're telling or the way they're going about it, I feel like, you know, them having to start over and then they started with those aftermath books were really just to set up, here's where we are for episode 7.
Hmm.
And then episode
Hmm.
7 came out, and then now we can start to tell stories after episode 7, you know,
Hmm.
but they really didn't want to do anything, you know, between that and The Last Jedi. So then, you know, on the comic side, they went back to the original trilogy, and it felt like we have a lot that covers, you know, you got Rogue One, you got A New Hope, you have a lot of
Hmm.
stuff between A New Hope and Empire. Then, you know, there's stories that are being told between like 3 and 4.
Yep.
And on the game side, you know, now we've got Fallen Order, which is an incredible video game. I love the story.
Yeah.
It's the only game that we've gotten
Hmm.
that tells a story, really. I mean,
Right.
you have like a 5-hour Battlefront
Sure.
campaign, which is good,
Hmm.
but not worth the $50 at the time, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Just for a game that you would expect that's a
Hmm.
Star Wars game. So I just feel like the new canon is just filling these gaps of time, whereas in the Legends, as we're calling it now, it felt like there were, like you said, new characters, Mara Jade,
Hmm.
you know. I mean, obviously they did a similar thing with Han and Leia having a son, but they had
Hmm.
more kids in Legends, and it just felt like the characters they created, Thrawn, for example, you
Yes.
know, like those characters propelled the story forward,
Hmm.
and those characters, you know, they almost kind of transcended just the book or the comic or whatever they were in, you know, the game. I mean, you've got Kyle Katarn, you
Yeah.
know, he was, you know, they did a sort of multimedia thing where he was in games and he was also in a few books and things.
Hmm.
And, you know, he became like a fan favorite. And, you know, they're borrowing parts of those types of characters to maybe put onto a character like Finn potentially, if
Sure.
we're saying that he's a little force sensitive. So, you know,
Yeah.
they're borrowing from Legends and putting Thrawn in Rebels and things like that. So that's really cool to see,
Hmm.
but it doesn't feel like, mostly on the novel side, because we don't have a lot of books to, or a lot of games to go off of,
Hmm.
that they're not pushing the stories forward.
Hmm.
But I'm hopeful with the High Republic, the way
Yeah.
that they've gone now, because I mean, the Old Republic era had a lot of
Yes. It does.
maybe a lot more comic and game materials than actual novels,
Hmm.
at least that I'm remembering. Maybe correct me if you know others, but that history was really rich in Legends, and
Hmm.
now it's just blank.
Yeah.
And so I'll be excited to see if we can get away from the Skywalker saga to maybe
Hmm.
push that envelope forward or have these monumental events. But
No, the Old Republic definitely is, yeah, definitely much richer it was in the Legends because you had kind of the, I'm kind of hazy in my timeline, lines is basically, but like prior to the prequels, we'll just say that is you had Darth Bane series, you had even right up before prequels, you had some stuff with Palpatine and Plagueis, But yeah, going like thousands of years, you had the Knights of the Old Republic series, which is all the games and the online games, and there were some really good comics. I didn't read as much of the comics and Legends, but there was one series that I read and I was really loving right before the buyout. When this series went to the origin of essentially the Force, and it was really very much like not medieval, but almost very rudimentary kind of world. There were early versions of lightsabers, but it was like more of a sword than a lightsaber. But you had really cool origins there, and so it's a really nice story. And then yeah, you had the Knights of the Republic games, which were really cool. So we're really talking up about the Legends and how that felt important. But we also need to kind of think of the context of the time it took to create these stories. Of course, it started in like 78, so you had about 35, 36 years there of storytelling, and most of that was in the 90s and the early 2000s, I think if the number's right, I was trying to figure out how many stories there are. There's close to 400 books, comics, all these stories and legends. Right
Wow.
now, where we are in the new canon is we're close to 100. When we're 6 years into it, which is good. We're 6 years into it, and we're already almost a third, fourth of the way there. Whereas, yeah, you had all this time with legends. So, and it was great because you had stories that felt like it had crazy ripple effects in legends. I will do a little bit of a spoilers. So if you haven't read a lot of legends, which you still should, because they're still good stories, people who are watching this, but like Mara Jade and Luke, their kid had some really crazy stories that shook canon. I think it's pretty much mainstream there because for Chewbacca died in the books. I won't say which book if you haven't read it, but he dies in the books. So and then there's very much like Rise of Skywalker, or the sequel trilogy. There's a lot of similar stories with the Solo kids, going back and forth, dark side, light side, and crazy ramifications across the galaxy. These crazy stories, all these stories had huge impacts on canon and mythology, and it was a rich set of characters. So, but my whole thing with the beginning of new canon is that these stories I don't think are going to be as impactful. We're not going to get a debut of a character like Mara Jade in a book. I don't think. I don't think we're going to get these characters that matter. And I think I am starting to get disproven, if that's the right way to say it, of that, because the Aftermath trilogy, those stories, the what happens in those stories is pretty important to canon. It fills a huge hole. Again, it's filling a hole, but it tells a huge story about the kind of the true end of the Empire, and somewhat the origins of First Order as they go off into the unknown regions, and you're introduced to some big characters there, but they aren't, as of yet, I don't think, to the level of Mara Jade or to the level of the Solo twins or Thrawn. Even though Thrawn that's a good example actually, is Thrawn is now in new canon, but it doesn't quite feel as evil or as large.
Not as intimidating for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they put him in this little section of the timeline, which may have hurt it. If they put him later, which of course Dave Filoni is kind of teasing us into thinking that Thrawn is still around somewhere. So, and Filoni's good at bringing in those kind of legends stories. So there's possibilities is kind of what I'm getting at. There's still potential. Of course, now that the sequel trilogy is over, the new canon can go past the movies. It could expand on these stories that we now have, and it can sort of be canon for the next 30 years in a sense. Like they can have a new Jedi Order type series.
Well, that's interesting. Even the idea of having stories take place after Rise of Skywalker, I almost think unless they go way in the future, they won't create books and comics that are, Rey, Finn, and Poe post Rise of Skywalker, because there's most likely they're going to have other stories with those characters on screen, whether it's Disney Plus or whether it's a movie. Yeah. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of this potential issue with the new canon, is that because they don't feel like they can create a story and then rewrite it or do it differently, we've got these potential, I guess, like roadblocks that we're hitting to where it's like, I feel like as a viewer and, watching, reading, playing all kinds of different Star Wars content, I'm perfectly fine separating. If you want to make a comic book that's here's what happens when Rey rebuilds the Jedi Order, and then somebody wants to make a movie and do it completely different, fine with me. We used to have like the G canon, George's canon, which was the movies, and then you had all the books and things. So it meant that he could always change it at any time, because there were books and the legends that weren't as good, and they would play with characters that maybe George wouldn't actually do it that way. And I feel like that they could do that. The problem is, or one of the problems I see, is that they won't. And I feel like that kind of takes away some of the creative freedom that your storytellers could have, or that they're just kind of blocking out these time periods and saying we're not going to touch that, which is a little bit I don't know if it's like frustrating or just kind of sad that they could tell twice as many stories
Yeah.
if they weren't afraid
Yeah.
to, retcon it in the future or whatever.
And it would be helpful to know the mind of Story Group, and the publishers and the editors, to know exactly what their rules are for that, because it does, it does quite feel like, um, it still feels like we have that two-tiered of canon in a way. I don't know, like, yeah, the canon, or at least the movies, and even I would put the TV shows up there, because I think anything on screen is kind of held as like, this is the holy grail. You can't come close to it. You can support it, but you can't take it and run with it in new directions. Unless it's to explain something, or unless it's to fill another gap. Because we're seeing a lot of that with the new canon is they'll use a story, like maybe even the novelization of Rise of Skywalker. They'll use those opportunities to just answer little questions. Like one of the books that I read recently, new canon, Force Collector. It was a good story. It was a brand new character. He had his own little journey, which is good, but it also was like it jumped into these different stories of the films. You saw a little bit of Force Awakens. You kind of get Easter eggs of the Clone War era type stories. So it's like nostalgia, and it's kind of supportive in that sense, while adding a tiny little piece of new canon with this new character. So it was a good story, but it didn't feel like it pushed anything too much. It just kind of supported what was there and left it at that. Or stories will come close to the point of like pushing new canon, but then back off. Again, I think Aftermath kind of so far is like a big example of introducing this whole new aspect of canon that we didn't know. We only got the shot of the Star Destroyer and Jakku in Force Awakens, and we wondered what that was, and now we have this whole trilogy of books to answer that question. I think that was pretty cool. And I do think High Republic has a potential of becoming this huge era of new canon that is unexplored and new and fresh, even though it's technically in the prequels, kind of before the prequels and all this stuff. But I think it has potential, and it kind of brings, we're already kind of talking about it, but the next part of this is, will the new canon ever become important? Will it ever reach the status of Legends? I think you bring up a good point in that I don't think Disney will allow these authors or even video game creators to make a story of Rey having kids. I don't think that will happen in a book. It's something like that, or like Finn realizing his Force potential. That'll be in a movie. That won't be in a book. Or like the tease of Janna and Lando there at the end of the Rise of Skywalker. That's going to be a TV show probably. That's not going to be a comic book. Probably. So, and that stinks. I think you're right, though. I think you have a point there. I think that's my opinion of what's going to happen, and that's going to limit this new canon of EU. The authors are basically approaching this with one hand tied behind their back. So I do think, and we've said a couple times, these stories are good. We are getting great stories. Dark Disciple, Master and Apprentice, Catalyst, fantastic books. And Charles Soule and his comic series are amazing. And I'm excited what he's going to write for High Republic, and all the other authors, Justina Ireland and all these other authors are going to write for High Republic. I'm very excited about it because it's more Star Wars and it's fun. And it's the same themes, great characters. I just want, personally as a consumer, I just want the books to be unleashed in a sense, and the comics and the games to be unleashed in terms of bringing these major characters in, and if they don't make it to the big screens, that's fine. It's just a pipe dream of wanting that to feel as impactful as Legends did. But you're right, there was that distinction of G canon and the EU. You can write what you want, but if George Lucas ever made a movie to contradict it, it is what it is. So if the new canon becomes that, I mean, I guess I might be okay with it. I don't know. I would love it, but I do like that everything's trying to be connected. I do want it to feel connected. I just don't want it to feel like I like the fact that some of these books are definitely becoming essential. Some of them are, to shaping how we view the films, to making them better. I just I don't want it to become a bunch of alternate, Elseworlds or alternate timelines. I want it all to matter. I want it all to feel connected. So hopefully they'll keep connecting it all.
I think one example of a book that does it really well in the new canon. I love the book Catalyst. I thought it was
Yeah.
written really well. Centers around Galen Erso, and then ties right into Rogue One.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there are ways you can do that really well. Tell stories, that may not have, like you said, that huge ripple effect. But for him, he was instrumental in the building of the Death Star, and that was hugely impactful to why Luke was able to destroy it. So it's like.
Sure.
There are those moments where you can tie it into the Skywalker saga, but you would love to see us be able to go beyond that Skywalker saga. And I think those stories could become impactful in the EU if they allowed more creative freedom. Especially, one thing love to hear your thought on the game side, is I feel like there's a few types of games that we might never get. One example is, the KOTOR games. Those games allowed a lot of player choice and agency, to choose light side or dark side.
Yeah.
In the new canon, can they create a character that you could play it and end up as on the light side, and I could play it and end up on the dark side?
Yeah.
Are they going to let that kind of thing happen in the new canon? Because we haven't seen it yet. Yeah. And I feel like on a game level, that's a brilliant mechanic that allows players to really feel like they have a choice. And I love those type of games. But I just don't know if they'll do it with the new, canon structure.
That's a very interesting point, because I can see them attempting it, but maybe not as flexible as the KOTOR games are. Because even Knights of the Republic 2, when you're playing it, I remember there was a point where you're talking to a non-playable character, and it's kind of rehashing some of the events of the first game, and they're asking you, they basically ask you questions of like who Revan was and what happened, and you're answering based on what you did in the first game. So it's not quite setting in stone even there, but there is a Revan book that kind of sets in stone Revan as a character, what he looks like, and all this stuff. So, but you're right though. That would be interesting, because there's moments, it's like moments of like Fallen Order comes to mind, where you can change the color of his lightsaber, and people are like, oh, it's orange, pink, whatever. All these, is that canon now? And they're like, no, it's just it's just a thing you can do, like a mod you can put on a game. So I can see them approaching that level, but still having quick excuses. Story Group, I'm talking about Story Group. It's still having quick answers of like these little explanations of how it's not canon, and it's all this and that. So that's a good point. I hope they do.
I even feel like they don't need some of those excuses of like, don't like. I feel like as Star Wars fans and viewers and what playing this content, I feel like they should give us a little more credit that we can make these distinctions. Like if you have a game like that, like KOTOR, you don't even have to put it in canon. When people ask you canon questions about it, it's a game. It's like the 1313 game got canceled. Probably because it was going to center on Boba Fett. Well, and that was also pre the Disney buyout, so that may have had a lot to do with it. But just I don't know. I don't know how much it costs to do that, but like, just get that game out there. People wanted it. People still want it. If you want to tell a Boba Fett story later, a game and a TV show or a book or comic, like we can make that distinction. I feel like, and like there's a lot of examples like that where it's like, The Mandalorian would make it a brilliant video game. Yeah. Set it before season 1. The story already kind of goes like a game. He levels up, he gets new armor. Make it like a Grand Theft Auto style game. I mean, it would be incredible. But I worry that they won't do that or give somebody the freedom to make a game like that because, we might tell that story in a later season or in another thing. And it's like, I feel like they are, like you said, they're kind of one hand tied behind their back. And I think the canceled, I'm sticking with games right now because it's just I'm passionate about it. The canceled game that Amy Hennig was working on, the Project Ragtag, I think, the Visceral games. I read interviews from employees that said that they would have to wait a long time to get approval or feedback from Lucasfilm which would slow down the process of making assets for the game and development and then the production of it. And it's like, that's just the kind of thing where it's like, just give them a little more creative freedom. They don't have to painstakingly, oh, well, that one droid has to be, like fit into this. It's just like, it's a game. Like, just let it go a little bit and let people make good content or do what they're good at doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, I think we're hitting on pretty much somewhat of an answer a little bit, but Force Unleashed, those games, we were always told as consumers that these games are canon. That was like a big selling point of the game, is that this is George Lucas approved. The story is canon, and it was basically the origin of the Rebel Alliance. And how they kind of formed it to be. Or just recently, Sam we're on a Twitch stream, kind of talked about how George Lucas considered that in a sense an alternate reality canon, basically not G canon. He considered that, even though it was advertised as being the canon, it wasn't really considered that. So and Matt Martin from Story Group also made some similar comments about how essentially it's all fiction, people, because if you want to believe in your canon that Luke Skywalker married Mara Jade, had a son Ben Skywalker, and and then founded the Jedi Academy and did all this and that, and the Solo twins happened, and Thrawn lived in this era, not this era. If you want to believe that, then believe it. It's fine. It's all Star Wars and it's all good stories. So you can believe. I think just to make yourself sane, believe what you want to believe in a sense. For those of us kind of like me that I love consistency in canon, and I love when stories in all mediums tie together, even though it hasn't happened perfectly. Even Clone Wars contradicted the Ahsoka novel, and I think Rebels a little bit, from what I heard, contradicted the Ahsoka novel. It's been a while since I read that book, but it doesn't bother me as much as I thought it would. Because it's still good. They're all still great stories, and what we got in the Clone Wars show was amazing. I love that. And doesn't say E.K. Johnston, who wrote Ahsoka, is any, worse. Like, oh, poor her. She was trampled on in her story, her creativity. I mean, it kind of stings that subtle things are different, but her book is still good. Clone Wars is still good. And they both, for the most part, it's pretty much the same. It all works together, so it's fine. E.K. Johnston's writing Queen's Peril right now, or she wrote it already, and it's about to come out. But so those Padme prequel books are really good. So it's fun. It's a fun time we're in. I love the stories. I love the games. I want more. But you're right. They need to give more freedom to these authors. I think High Republic is a good test. So I'm not ready to say yet that new canon isn't as important as Legends. I mean, maybe at this point it isn't. I think it's kind of safe to say at this point it hasn't quite had the ripple effect. But again, like I said at the beginning, is we're 6 years into it. The first book was, looking at this short list here. The first book was A New Dawn, which I don't think had a crazy big opening, like reception. With the one about Kanan, right when Rebels started. But you did considerably had some pretty good books starting off the new canon. But still, again, 6 years, we're about 100 stories into this new canon. They're pumping them out fast. So I think it's just going to take some time. Hopefully, with that time, they will allow these authors more power to carry these stories off on their own. Again, like maybe give them another corner of the galaxy to play with that's more current in the timeline, or take a smaller character from the movies and build a franchise in the books off of them. I don't know. So, I mean, basically, the last question is, again, like, will it ever become? And I think it could. I don't know if it will, but I think it could become as important as Legends. I mean, do you think you're kind of talking like, I mean, I'm on the same page with you. Like, they may never let them build crazy book series about Rey, Finn, or Poe. But I mean, do you think, like, let's say 10 years down the road, do you think it could eventually get to that point?
I think different mediums probably have somewhat different answers, at least in my mind. I do
Yeah.
feel like the novels. I mean, there are some really good novels. I mean, even one I'll just sort of name drop on the
Oh yeah.
audio drama. Kevin Scott, who's also working on High Republic, did Dooku Jedi Lost, and
Yeah.
I love that. That's actually one of my favorites
Yes.
of the current, because
Hmm.
it really, less so than like taking a story and then propelling it forward, it kind of changes the way you see Dooku,
Hmm.
which is really
Hmm.
cool because I feel like his character needed a little more from the prequels,
Yeah.
to show his connection with the Jedi Order. But
Hmm.
anyway, I feel like the novels are trending in a direction where I think they've got the right kind of authors working and working together. And like you, I'm excited for High Republic to see, where they go, how they can tell
Hmm.
stories with totally new characters in a totally new era. And I'm fine with, I've tried to learn to let go some of my how I expect things to be. We always thought,
Sure.
there's not a lot of Jedi around, in this
Hmm.
time between the end of the
The
Clone
thousand
Wars and
millennia,
the
that kind of. Oh, that
well,
era. Yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm even saying like of the stories we know,
Yeah.
this idea that there weren't a lot of Jedi, besides Luke, and we've learned that a couple Jedi survived. We
Yeah.
learned about Kanan, like you mentioned.
Hmm.
We had this great game about Cal Kestis.
Hmm.
Maybe that is some of the recipe for how to do this: is create these new characters that we can really flesh out, and
Hmm.
they can have groundbreaking, heroic adventures
Hmm.
that maybe change the way you see something or help propel the story
Hmm.
forward. But on the novel side, I think yes, I think we can see really groundbreaking stuff, if
Hmm.
especially if we go to the Old Republic, maybe even
Yeah.
before the High Republic. On the game side, I think that's where I'm super worried, and maybe it's
Hmm.
because the games have been a little bit of, I'll just say, kind of a train wreck. I
Hmm.
mean,
Yeah.
EA hasn't made as many games as I feel like they should. They had a lot of games get canceled,
Yeah.
and it seems like that partnership. Now I know since then I don't know if they've hired or changed people's roles, and now they actually have a Lucasfilm Games department that's very similar to how LucasArts used to be.
Yeah.
That's overseeing, EA and how
Hmm.
they develop games. So maybe there's a way that they can change that creative pipeline, but it
Hmm.
seems like the ability to make every story canon and the way some game mechanics
Hmm.
need to work are
Hmm.
kind of like butting
Yeah.
heads. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
one example is I love Fallen Order, but if I'm making a game where you fight Inquisitors, I'm
Hmm.
making every Inquisitor a boss battle. I don't care if they were in Rebels or died or whatever.
Yeah.
I can erase that in my mind. I just want to sit down and play a cool game. It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
I won't drop spoilers for the game at all,
Yeah.
so I'll
Yeah.
stop there. But it's a great
And
game.
I don't know. I don't think you've played it, but Vader Immortal. It's the VR game. Even that feels more just like an interactive story that you're just kind of like guided through. It is a game, like you're fighting and you're playing, but more so I feel like I was just immersed in just watching a story unfold. So I had kind of both feelings of like reading something or listening to something versus playing a game. But that was a good way to also change perspective, even though it wasn't very long, so you didn't have a whole lot of time to sit with it. But for Vader, everything that Charles Soule had been doing in the comics and everything that happened in Vader Immortal, it really changes your perspective of what Vader has been up to during this time between 3 and 4. And really, for me, it changes kind of my perspective of him as a character in a great way. So you're right. Like a lot of these stories have been great in changing how we view these characters, which is amazing. But yeah, it needs to be really for me. I would like some really groundbreaking, introducing new mythology, introducing new characters that we can spend some time with for years and years. And again, it's in its infancy, so it has time to get there, especially in the literature side of things. I hope the games can get there. You're right. It's just I don't know. I mean, maybe it's that crazy pipeline that you were talking about. How they're waiting forever to get feedback. They can't just run with things. So I guess time will tell. But High Republic is very exciting to think of, and they have great talent behind it. So it already feels like a unified uh, experience of these just some story group and a lot of these authors coming together and mapping out this whole era and telling these stories. So So yeah, I mean, we're getting those first books this year, so it will. I'm looking forward to reading those. But I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't think we can answer this question for good for certain. You know, is it better? Is Legends better than canon, or is canon not as important to the overall Star Wars canon? I think we've kind of. I mean, I feel like we've kind of settled on our answer of it's not. It doesn't feel as impactful. It doesn't feel as important as Legends did. But there are different. What do you call them? There's different circumstances surrounding why that is. You know, we have these new movies that we're trying to, work around. You know, we have maybe even a much more tighter creative pipeline to work around than we used to at, in the old days. You know, we didn't have a story group. Lucasfilm didn't have a story group back then. So all he had was George Lucas to just get your story approved and like, oh yeah, he's fine. You can write that. You know, so it definitely feels like a different set of circumstances. So I don't know, man. I mean, do you think we've settled on anything like yet?
I think you summed it up good. Where it's, I would say I could probably almost definitively say not yet. It feels like new canon is not quite as impactful as the Legends EU, but with that caveat of saying, let's give it time. You know, I mean, and we're still going to consume it anyway. I love Star Wars. I'm going to play the games. I'm going to read most of the stories that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
But let's give it time. Hopefully, like High Republic, we can get there. And then on the game side, hopefully, honestly, I'd love to see them open it up and allow other developers to make games.
Sure.
But now it's really interesting because besides the movies, we've got TV, which we didn't have when we were growing up. This is The Mandalorian's the first Star Wars TV show, and that's a place where they're having new groundbreaking stories, and I love that. Yeah. So maybe now it's just there's a lot more opportunities to tell stories.
Yeah. I mean, my final thoughts really is just, I mean, without Disney buying Lucasfilm, I have no idea if we would have gotten anything. Maybe George Lucas would have still made movies at some point. I don't know. Maybe they would have been all 3D animation, since that's kind of where his head was at with the Clone Wars, which I actually would not have minded that. But who knows what Star Wars would look like now if Disney hadn't taken over and allowed for this new content. So I'm very thankful, like you, of what we are getting. I'm not gonna complain about it too much. Legends is still there. I can still consume that. There's still a lot of books I have that I still should read. Like I mentioned, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the first really major book. I mean, I think it was the first novel of Legends, and I need to read it. So. And people should play Force Unleashed. People should play KOTOR. I was played it like a couple months ago. So they're still great. It's a story. It's Star Wars. Consume it. So yeah, I like to be optimistic and think that this new canon will become every bit and more of what Legends was. So yeah, time will tell. But I think this was a good talk.
Yeah. So I enjoyed it.
So thanks, man, for letting me chat with you about this. So guys, you can watch this. I mean, you already are watching this on YouTube. So go to our playlist, our Council Sessions playlist, to watch our previous episodes. Share this video, write some comments, subscribe to our channel, subscribe to our show Inside the Force. You can find on anywhere you get your podcasts. Go to InsideTheForce.com. All the episodes will be right there for you. So please give us a look, give us some reviews, and enjoy the content that we are producing for Star Wars. So I'm Casey Cooley for Cody Geiler.
Thanks for having me. See y'all.
And I guess the council is adjourned.